While studying cnidarians, one of the examples of cnidarians are corals, and corals produce a reef structure that creates this unique ecosystem under the water. So we're going to take a look at how this unique ecosystem is changing over time. Remember that corals are anthozoans, and that means that they're part of the largest class of cnidarians. Most of these exist in colonies composed of thousands of different polyps that are all living together and working together. Corals secrete calcium carbonate, that's CaCO3 for those of you that remember your chemistry. You've encountered calcium carbonate a ton of times. It's in chalk. It's what makes Tums taste like chalk. And that's what gives the coral reef structure its solid hardness. Majority of coral species will form their reef structures over time because they're working together and they're all going to live within this reef system. Coral reefs have the largest biodiversity of any aquatic ecosystem. That biodiversity consists of algae, obviously coral because that's what makes the reef structure. Sponges live there, mollusks live there, crustaceans live there, sea worms live there, echinoderms live there, other cnidarians like jellyfish live there, fungus lives there, sea turtles live there, and a ton of species of fish also live there. In fact, more than 25% of all known fish species exist in a reef ecosystem. And because of this large biodiversity, we often refer to coral reefs as the rainforest of the ocean. The reef structure is extremely important for the survival of the coral. So the coral secretes that hard calcium carbonate skeleton, and that forms that base, that reef structure, or the substrate for the colony. And remember, a colony is a big group of coral all living in the same area. That skeleton provides protection because what can happen is those polyps can contract, and when they do so, they pull into that reef structure. And so when predators approach, the predators can't eat them because they can't get into the reef to eat them. It's these hard skeletal structures that build up coral reefs over time, and that helps protect the coral itself. The calcium carbonate secreted at the base of the polyps, so the living coral colonies can be at the surface of that, and then they can completely cover an area, and they, as I said, they can contract into that. So it's really important that they're able to secrete that calcium carbonate and create that reef structure. Just like sea anemone, coral have stinging cells along their tentacles, so they can capture prey. However, most coral has an endosymbiotic relationship with algae. Remember from biology, endosymbiotic means that they're living together. So they've co-evolved together. And what happens is the algae performs photosynthesis, and that provides the food the coral needs. The coral provides protection for the algae and access to the light so that it prevents the algae from being eaten by other organisms. So they live together, and that allows them to survive together. So here's the problem. When environmental triggers put stress on the coral, so it cannot provide the light or the protection that the algae needs in order to photosynthesize, the algae will leave the coral. The algae is able to survive on its own because it's going to travel to light and photosynthesize, but that coral becomes lighter in color because it no longer has the algae present. And if that stress doesn't go away, the coral co-evolved, so it no longer stings to get food. It depends on that algae. So when the algae leaves, if it doesn't come back, the coral will die. If environmental stress is what causes the algae to leave, we need to take a look at what are some of those stresses. And this list here is some of them, but not all of them. There can be disease that spreads to coral. There can also be excessive shade. And we have increased that excessive shade by parking more and more boats over top of coral reefs. We've increased the level of UV radiation that's coming through. That's why, you should sunscreen up when you go outside. There's an issue with sedimentation. So as dirt and sand run off into the water, that covers up the coral so that the algae can't be exposed to the sun. Obviously, changes in pollution is going to put a stress on that coral. Salt changes, and this includes both the thawing of icebergs, so that increases the fresh water, therefore decreasing the salt concentration. There's also the issue of like when we have extreme weather. If we have a really bad winter, every time that there's a snowstorm, we salt the roads. If we think there might be a snowstorm, we salt the roads. Well, the next time it rains or when that snow melts, it's going to run off, and when it does, it takes the salt with it, and that's going to increase the salt concentration. Also, we have increased temperatures of the water, and this is in part due to different ocean currents, including El Nino and La Nina. That's going to change the temperature in that area, and temperature changes can stress coral. The big so what is that warm water coral has been reduced by more than 30% since the 1980s. As early as 2050, coral could be considered an endangered species, and this will be due to dissolved carbon dioxide and the increased frequency of coral bleaching. And you might think, oh well, who cares if the coral goes away? Well, remember, the coral makes the coral reef, and the coral reef ecosystem is the rainforest of the water. And so if the coral dies, the reef system will too.